Hi, folks. This is Empowering Democracy, and I'm your host, Joe Firestone. I don't think your other host, Lisa Theobald, is going to be here for this stream. I hope that she would be, but she's still preoccupied with various family things. So we will proceed without her, okay, of course. Now, regrettably, and please share, like, and subscribe this stream. Hiya, Kay. How are you? It's good to see you. This is, it turns out, our 18th Empowering Democracy stream. Really kind of amazing. It seems like only yesterday that we started on this new program. But here we are already with 18 streams. So that's pretty good. And we'll be having some more streams tomorrow and Friday, too. So we are very busy. Kay, thank you for sharing in Facebook. That's important. I probably still have a lot of fans over there, though I don't know exactly where they are. So my topic for tonight is interest rate terrorism. And by that, I don't simply mean the rise in interest rates caused by the Fed, but kind of an effect of that then brings the austerity mongers out. So I want to share an article about that, which I will do now. The article is from the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, PGPF, which is probably the leading austerian institution right now in the private sector. They're still out there doing the best they can for austerity, with new wrinkles coming all the time. So here's their piece, as you see, from the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. And the title is Fiscal and Monetary Policy Work Best Together. And this is by Mark Sumerlin. And the question he starts off with is, what is the impact of inflation and rising interest rates on our nation's fiscal outlook? Low inflation generates economic stability and moderate interest rates, creating a more favorable fiscal backdrop. First question, more favorable than what? High inflation breeds instability, raising the risk of both higher interest rates and recession. Not just the risk of high interest rates. The first thing the Federal Reserve does when we hit high inflation is to put in high interest rates and to keep doing it until they cause a recession. The Congressional Budget Office is now projecting a rapid deterioration in the fiscal outlook, expecting net interest spending to more than double from 1.6% of GDP in 2022 to 3.3% of GDP in 2032. Uh, I don't know where they get that kind of a prediction because I don't think they understand at all the various forces in back of inflation. And so what they do is kind of take a guess without really having an operational theory that's been tested very much. In nominal terms, says Mr. Summerlin, net interest upward trend comes from persistently large budget deficits. Sorry, I kind of hashed that a little. Net interest spending will triple from 400 billion a year in 2022 to 1.2 trillion a year in 2032. Well, that sounds like substantial growth over a decade, but we do have to ask, uh, what will GDP be like in 10 years? Will our GDP be tripling in 10 years as well? What is the CBO's projection about that? I wonder. Much of this upward trend comes from persistently large budget deficits, but a meaningful part of the increase is due to higher inflation and interest rates. Between February 2021 and May of 2022, CBO raised its projected net interest outlays over the 2022 period by $2.5 trillion because of changes in projected interest rates and inflation. Well, that's nice, but why should we accept that? In other words, why put any faith in that projection at all? The CBO, over a decade, has a notorious record of incorrect projections. This deterioration in the current fiscal outlook may come as a surprise to those familiar with the story of how inflation helped lower the debt to GDP ratio after World War II. From 1945 to 51, the debt to GDP ratio fell from 115% to 75%. But there are critical differences between the post World War II era and now. From 1947 to 1951, the federal government ran a surplus that averaged over just 1% of GDP, while the nominal economy grew rapidly on average despite a brief recession. Today, the government is expected to run deficits that average 5% of GDP over the next decade. The second major difference is that the Federal Reserve capped the 10-year interest rate at 2.5% for 6 years after the war, as monetary policy was effectively run by the Treasury Department. Oh, can we do that again? Can we turn monetary policy over to the Treasury Department again? We could easily do that by reorganizing the Federal Reserve so it's within the Treasury Department. Seriously, though, why should we have any faith in the projected deficits that the Federal Reserve gives us? We have no reason to. over a decade period, the projections of the CBO are continuously off. Here it says the government is expected to run deficits that average 5% of GDP over the next decade. But what's to prevent the government from making decisions that cause it to run deficits that average 10% of GDP over the next decade? What kind of impact is that going to have on GDP? It might have a positive impact. It depends on what the government spends on. It depends on whether what they spend on is a good investment. The second major difference is that the Federal Reserve capped the 10-year interest rate at 2.5% for 6 years after the war, as monetary policy was effectively run by the Treasury Department. The government and the American people were more tolerant of high inflation, which reached 10% in 1948. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? After years of price controls during the war. But eventually the mood shifted and the Federal Reserve reclaimed its authority over monetary policy, ending the cap on interest rates and bringing inflation down rapidly after the Korean War. Today, the American people are deeply unhappy with inflation, and the Federal Reserve is committed to bringing inflation back down to 2%. With the Fed fighting inflation, the risk of recession has risen dramatically. Even the modest recession has a significant impact on the budget outlook. In the 4 years before the shallow 2001 recession, by the way, that recession was from 2000 to 2002, the debt to GDP ratio was falling 2.5 percentage points a year. But in the 3 years after the 2001 recession, the debt to GDP ratio was rising by 2 percentage points a year. So, what of it? Was that bad? What kinds of bad real effects on the economy did that have? This led the debt to GDP ratio 15 percentage points higher in 2004 than it would have been without a recession. Okay, why is that important? Of course, here they're implicitly assuming, Mark Summerlin is implicitly assuming that a rise in the debt to GDP ratio is some problem that we are not able to handle. The outlook for interest rates, says Summerlin, is complicated given the current high rate of inflation combined with a heightened recession risk. The Federal Reserve is trying to raise real interest rates while lowering inflation, leaving the outlook for nominal interest rates, which are a combination of real rates and expected inflation, uncertain. Even if nominal interest rates do not rise much further, an increase in real interest rates will erode the budget picture. CBO estimates that a sustained 1 percentage point increase in real interest rates would boost the deficit by about 1%, of GDP. And if real interest rates fall, it will likely be because the Federal Reserve put the economy into recession. In nearly all scenarios, excluding a supply-side induced drop in inflation, such as an increase in oil production, the budget deficit worsens. Okay, what is the budget deficit? Okay, the budget deficit is the excess of government spending over tax revenues that come in. And what does that mean? It means that government spending in a particular period is greater than government taxation. So it means that the federal government is leaving dollars in the economy because the government's deficit is the private sector's surplus. So what's wrong with that? Why should we worry about that? If real interest rates fall, I go on, it will likely be because the Federal Reserve put the economy into recession. In nearly all scenarios, excluding a supply side induced drop in inflation, such as an increase in oil production, the budget deficit worsens. So again, why is that bad? Is our government, which is a monetary sovereign, is it going to run out of money? Is it going to run out of money to pay off the debt instruments that are associated with the budget deficit? Obviously, the author seems to think so, because the author seems to be suggesting that's something we ought to worry about. Next, how should fiscal policy be used in this period of high inflation? In the current economic cycle, fiscal policy had a bigger impact on inflation than did the monetary policy. Uh, Inflation accelerated in the United States a year after the pandemic and a year before the war in Ukraine. It started almost immediately after $3 trillion of fiscal expansion was passed by Congress over December 2020 to March of 2021. Well, there was a pretty serious fiscal expansion that went on from March of 2020 to December of 2020 as well. As I recall, that expansion was perhaps $2 trillion itself. Why doesn't the author talk about that expansion? If a person decides to eat 4,000 calories in a day, it is the last 2,000 that leads to weight gain. The same principle held true with the pandemic fiscal expansion. The first $3 trillion was necessary, but the second $3 trillion was inflationary, as rigid supply chains could not handle a 25% of GDP fiscal impulse. Well, we don't really know that, because we don't know what would have happened if we had handled the politics differently, if we had regulated in order to absorb the second $3 trillion, if we had enacted excess profits, taxes. There were many different things we could have done to try to contain the inflationary aspects of the fiscal expansion. We didn't do any of them. Why didn't we do any of them? We didn't do any of them because the Trump administration knew from nothing about doing measures to contain inflation. The Trump administration had no concerns about inflation, at all, and surely didn't know anything about how to contain it. When the Democrats came in, of course, they had mostly the same problem. There were people they could have consulted to advise them how to contain the fiscal expansion, the kinds of measures that would have worked, like, for example, a federal job guarantee, like severe regulation in certain areas, like the windfall profits tax, like insisting that there be no price gouging and putting the price gougers in jail. All those things would have made a difference in the um, inflation. The idea that the first 3 trillion was necessary isn't necessarily true. The first 3 trillion was probably excessive and was probably not necessary. There was probably a lot of the first 3 trillion of expenditures which would have been just as expansionary if it had been differently targeted. Oh, by the way, we often point to the fact that in the CARES Act, we had the PPP loans. The PPP loans were supposed to be loans, but there was provision in the PPP Act for forgiveness of the PPP loans. Most of those loans in the end were forgiven, which meant, of course, that the net financial asset picture in the economy was substantially changed because the loans turned into grants. Now, nobody was concerned about that because those loans were going to businessmen. So nobody was complaining that the loans were being turned into net financial assets in the private sector. On the other hand, the same people became very, very excited when the federal government very recently began to figure that it was going to forgive student loan debt. Now, that was, of course, that was excessive. That was a moral hazard. That is something that shouldn't have been done, and that was inflationary. But forgiving, what was it, an $800 million loan to Marjorie Taylor Greene? That wasn't excessive. That didn't involve any moral hazard. Frankly, this article is nonsense. It details certain things that seem sensible from one perspective, but that are nonsensical from another perspective. It is a perspective which is very biased towards things that business people think are good, and against other things that business people think are bad. This analysis is suffused with moral judgments while claiming to be an objective analysis. The easiest way to assess the inflationary impact of U.S. fiscal policy is to compare the acceleration in core, excluding food and energy inflation in the U.S. relative to Europe, from the time the American Rescue Plan was passed until the start of the war in Ukraine. from February 2021 until February 2022, core inflation rose by 5 percentage points in the United States, while it rose only 1 percentage point in the euro area. My question about that is, so? What part of the American Rescue Plan was it? In fact, was it the American Rescue Plan at all? In the first stages of the CARE Act, all these loans were put out. When were those loans forgiven? When were they turned into net financial assets for the private sector? Not much of that might have gone on in 2021. In 2020. It might have been restricted to 2021 when the American Rescue Plan was passed. So the cause of inflation is attributed to the American Rescue Plan, but not to the fact that there were many, many loans that were being forgiven during 2021 that did not involve the American Rescue Plan at all, but involved the CARES Act. How do we know the inflation was increased by the American Rescue Plan and not by the CARES Act, whose loans did not have to be repaid? San Francisco Federal Reserve found that fiscal policy added 3 percentage points to U.S. inflation, similar to the difference in the increase in U.S. and European core inflation of 4 percentage points. Well, I guess I just like to see the models, because I just like to see how the Federal Reserve was able to disentangle the impact of the American Rescue Plan versus the impact of the CARES Act through this time. The assumption that's being made here is that the loans that were made from the CARES Act in 2021 had their fiscal impact in 2021, when they may have had their fiscal impact in 2022. We all know that correlation is not causation, of course. But the question we have to ask is, what kind of modeling was done to tease out the likely causal factors here? Was there any confounding of the impacts of the American Rescue Plan with the impacts of the CARES Act? I would like to know. I haven't seen the model, but I suspect that the types of models the Federal Reserve was using was incapable of disentangling the causal impact of the CARES Act from the causal impact of the American Rescue Plan. I understand that the San Francisco Fed found that fiscal policy added 3 percentage points to U.S. inflation. But whether that's what happened, or didn't happen, depends upon the impact of the CARES Act. In other words, we don't know that the 3 percentage points, of inflation was caused by the American Rescue Plan as opposed to being caused by the CARES Act. One very unpopular way to reverse inflation would be to undo the fiscal support by taxing the lower and middle classes, which are sensitive to changes in income. Uh, One much more popular way, I'm adding something here, one much more popular way to reverse inflation would be to undo the fiscal support by taxing the upper classes who were the beneficiary of much of the support that came from the CARES Act. Yes, of course. Okay, it's true that the aggregate demand would drop more slowly if the taxes were targeted on the upper classes. Okay. But of course, this would be less politically perilous and would also make for a greater degree of equality in our economy. So I assume it would be more effective to undo the fiscal support for the lower and middle classes. While this sounds politically perilous, the same process is happening simply by letting inflation run unchecked. The fall in real income over the last year has clawed back 35% of the income gains generated by the fiscal expansion. The economy is, in effect, doing what politicians cannot do, reversing the excessive income gains from the fiscal expansion by imposing an inflation tax. A better approach would be to use the current period of excess demand to introduce a deficit reduction bill. The contractionary economic effect of a deficit reduction bill is front loaded. In other words, a long term deficit reduction bill could be introduced today when some cooling of demand is needed without any economic sacrifice. I think he's talking in the macro sense now because there certainly would be economic sacrifice on the part of the middle class people and the workers who would be suffering from that kind of deficit reduction bill. The recently passed Inflation Reduction Act has a negligible amount of deficit reduction over the next 5 years. Without action by Congress to reduce the demand, the Fed will be left to do the heavy lifting. Relying on the Federal Reserve alone is a policy decision to clobber the housing market, which is most affected by a change in interest rates. The Federal Reserve's new anti inflation policy has already raised mortgage rates over 5%, stalling house sales and making it difficult for first time buyers to enter the market. Well, I do agree with that. Fiscal and monetary policy work best together. But monetary policy affects financial conditions and the level of bank reserves, while fiscal policy can put money directly in or take money directly out of people's pockets. Without fiscal policy as a tool to fight inflation, the federal government is working with one hand tied behind its back. The Federal Reserve, acting alone, is in fact attempting to increase the number of people without a job, expecting the unemployment rate to increase from 3.5% to 4.1% under its latest projection. The Fed is hoping to slow wage growth and spending indirectly. Fiscal policy can slow spending directly by raising taxes or reducing government direct payments without necessarily having the intermediate step of raising the unemployment rate. Modest upfront fiscal contraction would reduce the cumulative amount of monetary tightening necessary, improving the odds of avoiding a recession. Of course, any action to reduce inflation is riddled with risk. The best policy would have been to avoid inflation in the first place. It is hard to argue with that. Uh, so this particular piece is an austerian piece, suggesting that the rise in interest rates are somehow dangerous to the macro economy. The implication being that the interest rates will cause the interest payments to go so high that other federal spending will be crowded out. However, if we undertake federal deficit spending um, at the same time, and we moderate what the Federal Reserve is doing to contain inflation, but use other measures to contain inflation, like windfall profits taxes and price controls and tighter regulation of certain target industries, uh, we could then fight inflation, grow GDP faster, and because the growth of GDP is outdistancing the growth in federal debt, uh, we could be successful in avoiding inflation. There are different ways to do this. There is no need to spend less if you spend on the right things that can be absorbed by the economy. That perspective does not enter this piece on fiscal, and monetary policy. We ought to seek both full employment and price stability. Those two things can be pursued at once, and they can be achieved at once. We have to stop using the tool of raising interest rates as a way of containing inflation, because in the first instance, it does not contain inflation. It is inflationary. It doesn't begin to contain inflation until it crashes the economy, until it crashes the labor market. It is dangerous to raise interest rates too fast and but too far. The best way to deal with inflation, the best ways, involve taxing, also price controls, also regulation of supply chains. When those methods are used, it's not necessary to burden the middle, and working classes. And it can be very effective in controlling inflation as it was during the Second World War. Okay, as to whether too much of the federal budget is consumed by debt, that's a problem that is very, very easy to handle because there is no need to finance deficit spending, okay, by issuing debt. People think we need to issue the debt because somehow, if we do issue debt, that will hold back inflation, contain inflation, if we match every dollar of deficit spending with a dollar of debt. But no such relation uh, has been validated by empirical data. There's no evidence to show this. From a theoretical point of view, if we simply issue money and take other measures to contain inflation, our spending need not be any more inflationary than spending while issuing debt on a dollar for dollar basis. We need to end austerity. We need to stop assuming that we have to deficit spend, okay, by issuing debt. We do not have to. Okay, we can issue money. At, we can have programs that issue reserves to particular parts of the private sector that can tolerate the federal spending in those particular sectors. And we can avoid the inflationary impacts by seeing to it that the excess money, okay, involved, okay, is not going to those who already have the money. We can manage that, but we have to try. And the first step is to stop the issuance of debt, okay, in the first place, but to simply spend the money when we want, okay, to deficit spend. Okay, thank you for listening. I'm going to check out your comments right now. Kay Ryan says austerity kills. Steve Day says, why reduce the federal deficit? Yes, I was saying the same thing. Why is having a big deficit bad? And I pointed out that when we run deficits, we leave the deficit money in the private sector, in private sector pockets. And that is good for the economy and good for the people. Kay says tax the rich and the corporations. Yes, I think so too. But I also think the key here is tighter management of the economy. It's regulation where you need to have the regulation. It's price controls where you need to have the price controls. So I think that's it for me for today. and I'll be seeing you again tomorrow. I do want you to understand that what I meant by interest rate, but terrorism here was articles like this one that talk about the harm done by having a very large interest bill. And I wanted to point out that you needn't have the large interest bill because you don't have to issue the debt. Instead, what you can issue are platinum coins. You can use overt, congressional financing. You needn't issue debt to correspond with deficit spending. Federal deficit spending and federal debt issuance are two different things. So with that, okay, I'm going to leave you, and I'll see you again hopefully tomorrow morning, if not in the early afternoon. I'll have a late afternoon stream, and I will also have the Dump the Corruption stream at 9 o'clock. What Ezra and I will do, okay, among other things, we're going to do all sorts of things, but he's been studying very closely the fundraising that has occurred for people running for Congress and people running for the Senate. And this last quarter was a particularly successful fundraising quarter for many of the progressives. And we're going to hear about that tomorrow because, of course, their success in raising funds will be very important in the closing weeks of this campaign. We'll also be talking tomorrow somewhat about John Fetterman again. And we'll also be talking about, let's see, and we'll also be talking about a race out in Oregon, where the Oregon version of Herschel Walker is running against Andrea Salinas, who won her primary out there in the 6th CD, okay, of Oregon, and who is kind of half a progressive. Doesn't have a reputation as a flaming progressive, but in fact is a reasonably progressive candidate who is well integrated into her community. And she's facing a Republican, very wealthy person. First, she had to run against one of the Bitcoin the billionaires. Now she has to run against this guy, Mike Garrison, who is very, very flush with capital as well, and who's been throwing money at this campaign. We'll see if she can beat very rich people twice in the same campaign. It'll be interesting to find that out. So good night for now. Please do visit my Patreon page from time to time. Please do visit my Buy Me a Coffee page. I can't do these 3 streams a day without having at least some degree of support. I'd like to thank Sandy Degg for her generosity. She has certainly helped. So I'd be very grateful if some others could visit either Patreon, okay, or buy me a coffee to contribute to the well-being of this new 3 stream a day, 5 days a week program. So thank you and good night. Sandy says, love you 2K. I see Sandy is smiling at my last words. I didn't really know whether you wanted me to go public with that, Sandy, but I figured you wouldn't mind. Okay, good night, everyone, again.